Hello everyone. I would like to take a moment to let you know about a demo app we have created to showcase the concept of our ancient Greece revisited AI project. We would like you to try it out and send us feedback, which we'll evaluate to decide if it's a project worth pursuing or not. The app is a demo of features and logic, but it doesn't have any trained models or AI frameworks built into it. It uses generic LLMs, so don't expect to get some valuable content out of it. We would like to hear your feedback on the general approach of the project and not the actual results, at this stage at least. So, try it out, and thank you very much.
Gnosticism is so wide,
Yes.
it was never a religion the way Islam
No.
or Christianity.
Yeah.
It was a religious tendency, a religious orientation.
Yeah,
And-
like we find in the Greek magical papyri where they're mixing and matching Osiris and Jesus. Yeah.
But that's
Very
the thing.
chaotic.
So it's so wide that people who try to tackle it and answer the question usually focus on one aspect. There's this famous book by Helen Pagels, I think.
Elaine Pagels.
Helen Pagels,
Yeah.
one of the early books on Gnosticism.
Yes.
That kind of opened the subject up to Western audience.
Right.
And her Gnosticism is essentially, the Christian Gnosticism is essentially a Christian
Yeah.
sect in a way. But Gnosticism is far wider than that. And I think to understand it, you have to zoom out and look at its extent and say, there was a Christian Gnosticism through the works of the apocryphal, the so-called apocryphal Gospels, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Judas. There was a Greco-Egyptian Gnosticism with the works of Hermes Trismegistus.
Yes.
You have a more proper ancient Greek Gnosticism with Orphism, that is a
Yes.
very, very ancient religion, possibly predating the Homeric one, but gets Gnostified
Yes.
as
You
it
have this group-
progresses
Yeah.
towards the Common Era.
You had this group called the Nassenes living in Asia Minor in the 2nd century.
Hmm.
They were led by a man or maybe a woman because it doesn't say what gender he is. I think it's probably a man just because it doesn't. I think they would specify if it was a woman.
In the time.
But someone's pointing out to me, hey, they never actually say it's a dude. Anyways, someone named the Nassene preacher, probably a dude, living in Asia Minor, Phrygia. They even call themselves Phrygians, by the way. And this guy was comparing Jesus to not only for some reason mainly Attis, who
Attis.
Attis. Let me just take a quick detour. I'll come back to what I'm saying. During this time period, in the middle of the 2nd century, there was a Roman festival called the Hilaria that happened during the week of what was at the time Easter, because they had during this time there was a fixed spring equinox. Now our spring equinox moves depending on, because we have a different calendar. This time it was March 25th. During the Holy Week, the same thing they call Easter Holy Week.
In Roman times.
Yeah,
In
and
pagan
they do
Rome.
now too.
Yeah.
We call Easter Holy
Yeah.
Week here in Greek. They're calling it
Yeah.
that. In Rome, they called this the Holy Week during the spring equinox, and they have a festival dedicated to Attis and the Great Mother, where they bury the dead effigy of Attis on a tree.
Mm-hmm.
And I think me and Stephen were in church, and we heard someone say, on this day Christ was fastened to a tree, and I'm like, whoa, that's like the same thing that happened to Attis. Anyways, they bury the tree on a pine tree. They bury him on March 22nd. I think it's March 22nd. On the 3rd day after that, they go into mourning for 2 days.
Yeah.
And they go into mourning. On the 3rd day,
He gets resurrected.
they call it the Hilaria, which means in Latin, rejoicing. And they say, according to Firmicus Maternus, who's writing later in the 4th century, but he's what he says. He says that the priest cries out, our God has been saved, and we are saved through his sufferings. This was an Attis festival. Now,
What year?
so according to John Liddus, another late source, Claudius instituted these rites. Now, there are some scholars who say, I would like to see more concrete sources about what Claudius instituted. He might have instituted something different, and it might have grew like this over time. Some scholars think Christianity influenced this. I don't. I don't think the Romans are looking at Jewish cults to adopt things. I think it's the other way around. They're the Beatles. They're the Roman imperial cult. They're the big religion everyone's looking at. I think it's the other way around. But anyway, that's another topic. The point is, by the time we get to the 150s, we know for a fact that all these rites were already instituted because Marcus Aurelius added a new day called the Day of Washing. And we also know that Antonius Pius also, there's a source about what he was doing during the Holy Week of Attis. So during this time, when the Phrygian Christians, called the Nassenes, are worshiping Jesus, the Nassene preacher, according to Hippolytus, told his students to go and visit the Hilaria because in the rites of Attis, you will see the rites of Christ, which is, whoa, that is so heretical. These are pagan Christians. The Nassene preacher, in what's called the Nassene hymn, you can look this up, it's all over the internet. He compares Jesus to not only Attis, but also Dionysus. He also compares him to Adonis. It's this beautiful hymn. It's from the Homeric hymn to Attis. I don't know if you ever heard this, where he says, "You are the son of the great mother, Phrygian Attis. Some Egyptians call you Osiris. All of Greece calls you Bacchus. All of Syria calls you Adonis." And he goes through the list of all these sons of God characters, and this is Attis being compared to him. But what this Nassene preacher did, he crosses off the name Attis and puts Jesus on there. And he says Jesus was called Osiris, he was called Dionysus, he was called Adonis, he even calls him Pan. Whoa, right? So he's saying all these characters are, so what I'm basically saying is, these Nassene Phrygians were like pagan Christians of the 2nd century.
Yeah, but there's one element I think that's missing, because, I get bombarded about ideas that usually come from this documentary called Zeitgeist.
Yeah.
The first one. And what you said is pretty much
Everyone always brings that up when I get into these
a
subjects.
summary of that.
Well, they made a lot of stuff up that isn't
They
true.
made a lot of stuff
This
up.
is primary sources.
To be fair, because I follow the guy who did it online.
Joseph.
Like, look,
Peter Joseph.
This was an artistic project.
Yeah.
He was a musician and he created.
He used bad sources.
But it wasn't about good scholarship.
No, it was bad.
About background. It was literally the way he explains it.
Yeah.
He had a concert and he wanted some cool visuals in the background. So he stitched up a few videos that would play, because I think his music was instrumental.
Yeah.
So the voiceover.
He ruined this. He ruined this entire discourse, because what I just said.
Well, he opened it up for all people.
He damaged it. Because
you think?
What just happened just now is I brought up primary sources that are real primary sources and Zeitgeist. And then boom, now this whole entire thing shut down. But these are real primary sources.
But
they need to be, I think, discussed.
But here's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
The reason I bring it up is that because that is very exciting to a lot of people.
Yeah, it was a huge documentary.
Exactly.
But the scholarship, for good reason, shut it down, because the whole thing was done wrong.
Yeah.
They made it all about astrotheology, and they said that all these other gods were born of a virgin, had 12 disciples. Horus was dead for 3 days and resurrected. That's not true. None of the sources were. In fact, even Attis, that I just brought up, in the myth of Attis, none of that happens. It's only reflected in the Roman tradition,
the Roman tradition.
And that's very important to point out.
But what I'm saying is that with good scholarship or with bad scholarship, with primary sources or with a video that was meant just as a background, some music festival, you have this core idea that Jesus is essentially a rehashing of what some scholars have called the ever-rising and ever-dying God.
The dying and rising God, yeah.
The dying
James
and the rising
Fraser.
God. James Fraser brought this up. Arthur Evans, who excavated Crete to uncover the Minoan civilization, brought it.
This would have been top scholarship for 1900 to 1950.
Exactly.
After 1950, this gets shut down.
This gets shut down, apart from people like Joseph Campbell, who carry it through the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, keep on, presenting it. There's obviously things there, undeniably, and you just mentioned some primary source. But there's an element to the Jesus story which I think sets it apart.
Absolutely. I agree 100%.
And we shouldn't just go, oh, he's just another Dionysus. Oh,
no, I don't think so.
Exactly.
I don't think so. Yeah.
I
don't even think the Nassene preacher thought that.
Okay.
I think what the Gnostine preacher was doing
Try to make it friendly.
was trying to incorporate elements of the culture to Christianity.
What makes Jesus special, you believe?
Well, number one, he was a real person, I think. I don't think, I'm not a mythicist. I do think he's a real person. I think he had a unique story. He lived in Nazareth in Judea, and the other gods can't necessarily say that. Also, at the same time, I do think when people are writing the Gospels, they're making them legend. So Alexander the Great, real person. Julius Caesar, real person. But when you read Suetonius and when you read the Greek Alexander romance, you're going to see there are stories of gods being applied to these real people. So even though, yes, Jesus is completely, in his own right, completely unique and a real story that people need to separate from these other Dionysus and stuff, we got to keep in mind when stories are being written, there's a tendency to do mimesis, there's the tendency to take legends and do a counter, like polemics. So you might have, there's legends of Dionysus, or not Dionysus, legends of the priest of Dionysus taking empty jars and putting them in a temple. So Aristotle writes about this. Pausanias writes about this. There's a bunch of sources that write about this. And they look back in the temple the next day and it's filled with wine. Well, then you look at Pliny the Elder, who says this happened on January 6th, called Theodosia. And then you look at church tradition, and they say the wedding of Cana happened on the night of January 5th, heading into January 6th. So you're like, okay, yes, Jesus is not the same as these other gods. We shouldn't just put him as a type of a dying and rising God. But I also want people to know that a lot of the culture is being reapplied and reshaped and remodeled. And I don't think Jesus necessarily gets to sort of be completely separated from this stuff.
No, that is very legit. And I think a lot of people need to look at this in the eyes